Mason Reyes had been a shadow patient for 6 days. He arrived at Coral Ridge Medical Center a little after midnight, carried in on a stretcher by 2 men in plain clothes who said almost nothing. No dog tags, no wallet, no name on his chart beyond the words written in blue ink by a tired admitting clerk. John Doe, Trauma 4. Shrapnel had torn through his left side during an operation that nobody in that hospital was cleared to know about, and by the time the paperwork was signed, the 2 men who brought him in were already gone. They left behind a phone number that rang once and then disconnected, and a folder with a single line typed across the front: handle with discretion. Dr. Elena Castellanos had been a trauma surgeon for 11 years. She had seen frightened patients, angry patients, patients so deep in shock they could not remember their own names. She knew what silence usually meant after a violent injury, and she knew how to wait it out. But something about this man's silence was different. It was not the blankness of shock, it was control. His eyes were never still. Even sedated, even in pain, they moved, tracking the door, the window, the badge clipped to her coat, the hands of every nurse who stepped near his bed. It was the watchfulness of a man who had spent years learning that a room was never truly safe until he had checked it himself. "He's not mute," she told the charge nurse during evening rounds, keeping her voice low outside his door. "He's choosing not to speak, and until I understand why, I can't finish treating him properly. I don't know what he's hiding, what hurts worse than what I can see, or what he's afraid will happen if he opens his mouth." A psychiatrist came and left with nothing. A hospital social worker tried gentle questions about family, about home, and received only that same unblinking stare. Twice, 2 quiet men in dark jackets returned, flashed identification that the front desk was not permitted to ask about, and sat beside his bed for exactly 11 minutes each time. They left without any answers either, and without leaving any for the staff. By the 6th night, Mason Reyes was simply the silent one to everybody who passed his room. A mystery wrapped in bandages, healing slowly, saying nothing. Then, on the 7th night, a new nurse started her rotation on the trauma floor. Her name badge read, P. Anand, RN. Nobody at Coral Ridge knew that Priya Anand had spent 4 years as a combat medic attached to Joint Special Operations units before she went back to school for her nursing license. She never mentioned it in interviews. It was not the kind of experience you listed on a resume, and it was not something she talked about at lunch. She had learned, the way soldiers do, that some chapters of a life are better carried quietly than explained out loud. Her first assignment that night was room 14, listed simply as Trauma 4. She walked in, expecting a routine vitals check. What she found instead made her pause in the doorway for just a moment before stepping fully inside. It was the stillness that caught her, not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of a man lying awake and pretending otherwise, cataloging every sound in the hallway. She noticed the way his left hand rested slightly curled against the blanket, an old habit rather than an injury. She noticed the faint white scarring across his knuckles, the kind that came from years of hard use rather than a single accident. She noticed, most of all, the way his eyes went to the door before they ever went to her face. She had seen that particular kind of stillness before, on men who did not officially exist, on men whose service records were sealed so tightly that even their own families sometimes did not know the truth of where they had been. She checked the IV line without hurrying, moved to adjust his blanket, and spoke without any dramatic weight in her voice at all, as if she were simply thinking out loud. "Whiskey Tango's still standing," she said quietly, "if that means anything to you." It was an old call sign, the kind whispered across secure channels in places that never made headlines. Retired the same day a task force ceased to officially exist on paper, though it never truly stopped existing for the men who served in it. For 6 days, Mason Reyes had not said a single word. Now his head turned sharply toward her, and for the first time since he arrived, his eyes locked onto another human being, as though he were truly seeing them, not just measuring the distance to the exit. "Who told you that?" he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but the words were clear. Down the hallway, Dr. Castellanos heard something she had been waiting 7 days to hear, the sharp, urgent beep of a monitor spiking, not from a wound, but from a heartbeat reacting to something that mattered. She hurried into the room, expecting a crisis, and instead found her silent patient staring at the new nurse, as though she had just unlocked a door he had sealed shut. "Nobody told me," Priya said calmly, checking his pulse with steady hands, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. "I earned that name the same place you did. Different team, same war nobody back home ever hears about." Dr. Castellanos stood in the doorway, watching the exchange with quiet astonishment. She had spent a week failing to reach this man with every tool medicine offered her: patience, gentleness, professional distance, direct questions. And here was a stranger in scrubs, standing at his bedside, reaching him with nothing more than 2 words spoken in a shared language neither of them had ever expected to use again in a hospital hallway. It was not magic, and it was not some miraculous cure. It was recognition. One person who had lived through something unspeakable, seeing another person who had lived through the same kind of unspeakable thing, and offering the only proof that mattered. "I know. I was there too, in my own way. You are not as alone in this room as you think you are." Mason did not pour out his story all at once. Healing rarely works that way, and Priya did not expect it to. Instead, small pieces came loose over the following days, the way ice breaks apart slowly before it truly melts. He began answering her medical questions directly, instead of with silence. He told her, quietly, that the pain in his side was worse at night, when the hospital grew quiet, and his mind had nothing to do but replay what had happened. He told her he could not sleep with the door closed. He told her, without ever using names or details that would break the secrecy his work required, that he had lost people. Recently, people whose names would never appear in any newspaper, whose sacrifice would never be publicly honored, because the mission itself would never officially be acknowledged to have happened. Priya listened without pushing. She never asked him to explain the operation, or why 2 quiet men in dark jackets kept appearing and disappearing from his room, or why his official identity seemed to exist only as a folder marked "Handle with discretion." She understood, better than almost anyone else in that hospital could, that some truths were not hers to ask for. Her job was not to unlock his secrets. Her job was to make sure he did not have to carry them entirely alone while his body healed. Slowly, the rest of the trauma team began to see a different man than the one who had arrived 7 nights earlier. Mason started answering Dr. Castellanos' questions with more than single words. He allowed the physical therapist to work with him without flinching away from unexpected touch. He even managed, on one particularly good afternoon, to make a dry joke about hospital food that left one of the younger nurses laughing in the hallway. But it was Priya he watched for at the start of every shift. It was Priya's voice that made his shoulders relax, even slightly, whenever she walked through his door. Dr. Castellanos noticed it too, and rather than feeling pushed aside, she felt something closer to relief. Medicine could set bones and close wounds, but it could not always reach the parts of a person that had been broken by things a hospital chart would never record. Priya had reached that part, simply by speaking a language of shared experience that no textbook could teach. One evening, about 10 days into his recovery, Dr. Castellanos found Priya finishing her charting at the nurse's station and sat down beside her. "You know something I don't," the doctor said. It was not an accusation, only an honest observation. Priya considered her words carefully. "I know what it looks like when someone comes back from somewhere they can't talk about," she said. "I lived it myself, for a while. You don't need to know the details of his mission to help him heal, Dr. Castellanos. You just need to know that some patients aren't guarding secrets because they don't trust you. They're guarding secrets because trusting the wrong person, even by accident, could put other people in danger. Once he understood I wasn't going to ask him to cross that line, the rest became easier." Dr. Castellanos nodded slowly, filing the lesson away the way she filed away every hard-won piece of knowledge in her long career. It was not something she had learned in medical school, but it was something she would carry with her into every future patient whose silence she did not yet understand. 2 weeks after he arrived, Mason Reyes was cleared for transfer. The same 2 quiet men in dark jackets returned one final time, this time with a wheelchair and paperwork that named no hospital, no destination, and no forwarding address. The staff at Coral Ridge had grown used to not asking questions about Trauma 4, and this final visit was no different. Before he left, Mason asked to see Priya one more time. She came to his room still in her scrubs, at the end of a long shift, and found him sitting upright, dressed, steadier than she had seen him in 2 weeks. The wariness that once filled his eyes had softened into something closer to quiet gratitude. "You didn't have to say anything that first night," he told her. "You could have just checked my vitals and let me stay quiet. Nobody would have blamed you for it." "I know," Priya said, "but nobody should have to heal completely alone in a room full of strangers, not even someone like you." He did not salute her. That was not something men in his position were permitted to do. Not for people who officially never existed inside rooms they were never officially in. But he held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, the kind of look that carried more weight than any formal gesture could have. "Whiskey Tango," he said softly, almost like a private joke between them now. "I owe that call sign more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe it anything," she said, smiling for the first time since she had met him. "Just take care of yourself out there, wherever there turns out to be." He was wheeled out through a side entrance a few minutes later, the same quiet way he had arrived, disappearing back into a world that would never officially record that he had been at Coral Ridge Medical Center at all. No discharge summary would carry his real name. No insurance record would exist. To the outside world, Trauma 4 would simply close its chart and become an empty room again, ready for its next patient. But inside that hospital, something had changed that would not be written down in any file either. Dr. Castellanos found herself thinking differently about every silent patient who came through her doors afterward, wondering what unspoken language might be needed to finally reach them. The younger nurses on the trauma floor spoke, in quiet corners between shifts, about the mysterious patient who had said nothing for 6 days, and then everything once the right person finally spoke to him. And Priya Anand went back to her ordinary rounds, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, carrying her own history quietly, the way she always had, never once mentioning what had happened in room 14 to anyone who had not been there to see it themselves. In a hospital hallway humming with fluorescent lights and the ordinary noise of ordinary lives, two people who had both learned, in very different ways, how to survive in silence, had understood each other perfectly, without needing very many words at all. And somewhere beyond the walls of Coral Ridge Medical Center, in places that would never appear on any map handed to the public, a man who had once refused to speak carried that understanding forward with him, proof that even the quietest wounds could begin to heal the moment someone finally spoke the right words first.